And I don't know how many people are on right now, but what I would like to encourage is that you guys ask as many questions as possible, or else this is going to be pretty quick. I will be just reading a bunch of slides, and normally it's interactive, and we do this in person, so we have open dialogue and communication. However, since we're doing this on a webinar, it's a little bit one-sided. I would love to share everything, but I also want to know what you guys want to know, so we can actually cover some of the items that are more important to you guys. Instead of me just ranting about what we do on a daily basis. So with that being said, we'll begin. So if you guys don't know me, I am a part of the Arcadia Association. I've been with the association for several years, and I have been the commercial chair for it was last year and the year before, currently on the board. I was president of the CCIMLA chapter last year, as well as a few other boards in the past. So, and at the moment right now, I have my own brokerage, and I have had it for about 4 years, and we do a lot of leasing, hence, right now I'm talking about letters of intent. And we also do other services. We also provide investment sales, business sales, and property management. And so here we go. I'm going to talk about leasing and letters of intent, and the topics that we're going to be covering. They're going to be basically things that you would find in a typical AIR lease. So that's kind of the order that I'm going in. And obviously people use AIR leases, they also use CAR leases, but I do find that if you're working for the landlord, you probably want to use the AIR leases. They're a little bit more landlord friendly. Typically CAR leases are a little bit more tenant friendly, so depending on who you're working for and who you're representing, choose wisely. Okay. So one disclaimer right now is that all materials and examples taught in this course are based on personal experiences and may differ from agent to agent. And the course is meant to teach the standard or typical case within a commercial transaction. Due to the nature of commercial real estate, there are many ways to negotiate and close a transaction. So these are generally from my experiences. At this point in the last, I've been brokering for about 6 years, close to 6 years, and I've closed over 100 transactions, a good amount of them leases, so probably 100 leases at this point. So I'm just going off experience. There's still things that I haven't encountered, I haven't worked on, I haven't done, but there's a lot of things I have that are a little bit repetitive. So I'll give you typical examples and kind of the professional standard of what we're doing, so that you have a better gauge. Because I think a lot of questions I get are very specific, but I would give you general examples that are more like rules of thumb. All right. Okay, and things to remember: negotiations are very different depending on if you're representing the landlord or the tenant, and it's important to look at the entire deal and not just get stuck on one specific. There will be many cultural differences that you may have to explain or deal with in a lease transaction, and have a dependable list of affiliates, consultants, and contractors that you can refer. All right. So these are the items I'm going to go over. As you can see, the column on the left are the more standard ones I always put into my LOIs. The ones on the right I will include sometimes, and I'll definitely see it sometimes from LOIs that I receive. The items on the right are going to come up in the lease itself. So sometimes it's just better to address it early. If you have an issue that's potentially not as standard, then you want to address it. On the left, most of these are more financial terms, and then things that you just need to really work out up front, because there's always going to be, I guess, negotiations with most of the items on the left. Okay, so I'm gonna go one by one through all of these, and after each slide, I'm gonna pause to see if anyone has any questions, and Stephanie can just read those off to me, and then I'll address those. All right. So parties and entities. So this is pretty much the first line that you're gonna have to fill out. It's pretty much who is leasing, and it could be a variety of different entities, including individuals, partnerships, corporations, DBAs, etc. And what you want to make sure is that you have them all matching. So if it's an individual who's signing the lease, you want to have their driver's license, you want to have their contact information, etc. And then if you have a guarantor, you want the guarantor to be the one who's signing the lease. Just try not to get it mixed up where you have one person's name as the person signing the lease, then you have someone else as the guarantor, or you have a corporation as the entity signing the lease, but then the actual person who signs the lease isn't even ownership or doesn't have actual abilities to sign on behalf of the corporation, because that's when it gets hairy. And what you want to prevent when you match these up is that the landlord, and this is more for if you're representing the landlord, you want to make sure that they have someone clearly identified that they can go after if they end up in default for the lease. So that's the main reason for all of this. And when I presented this several years ago, it was a little bit more of an issue where you had, and in our area, we're working with a large Chinese community, and you have names that may not match. So even myself, as you can see right now, on my name it says Xiao Chen. That's actually my legal name, but I go by David. So if on my lease it says David Chen, but then you don't see that anywhere else, then it might, I could potentially disappear, you can't find me, etc. So you want to make sure that they're using their full legal name that is on their driver's license, and you want to also make sure that that photo matches their face. I've had instances where someone tried to use someone else's ID, so you want to make sure that that's not the case. And then if they are a corporation, that the person signing the lease is in the articles of incorporation for that company, or in that partnership with the signing rights. Okay. And you can also do your own investigation. If you get their credit report, etc. You want to just make sure that everything is matching. Yeah, because like I said, you just want to make sure you have the right person to chase after, and just avoid the scams. Because if things come back and something actually happens where there's default and the landlord can't chase out the person, and you might potentially get in a lawsuit where maybe the landlord sues you and says, hey, that was your job, that was something that you were supposed to take care of, that's part of your duties in your contract, to do the background checks, etc. And then you didn't perform. So there is some liability issues that may arise. Okay. Any questions right now, Stephanie?
No questions have come in yet.
Okay. So moving on. Next is the premise. So the premise is just the address of the location. Under the premise section, you might have the rentable square feet. I've been told recently that you may not want to put the rentable square footage there, just because if there's a discrepancy, then you may have an issue. And if maybe the offer came in as a per square foot number versus a gross number, then if there's discrepancies, then there's another potential issue that you have to negotiate. And preferably you just don't have to deal with as many, because there's just so many deal points to deal with, that you just want to minimize whatever you can to just put that in the past and get it complete and agreed upon. And also keep in mind that the square footage that they list, which is usually the rentable square footage, is not necessarily going to be the same as the usable square footage. I've had an issue in the past. Well, I mean, this issue comes up all the time, because you have loss factor and you have common area space that will be calculated into office buildings, industrial buildings, retail buildings, etc. So people who are unfamiliar with leases will come in and they'll measure the space, and they'll realize that, hey, this space is maybe 10% smaller than what's listed. But just keep in mind that there is going to be, in certain instances, there will be loss factor. And also when you measure, a lot of times measurements aren't just interior space to interior space. You have to include wall depth and certain other common area spaces that are going to be attributed to that square footage. And that would be the load factor and efficiency rates. Okay, and typically you should use BOMA standards, which is the main standard for measurement. Okay, and also in the premise, you might want to say if it's a retail, office, industrial, mixed use, etc. So just identify the product type. All right, moving on. So term, this is a big one, and usually it's not the biggest point that people negotiate, but I think it's a very important one, especially these days. We're dealing with a lot of short-term leases right now, just because we don't know what's going to happen. Both tenant and landlord are very skeptical, even though they still want to do a deal, get a lease done, but they don't want to commit too long. On the landlord side, they don't want to commit because they expect the economy to get better, and they don't want to lock in a low rate. The tenant side, they are skeptical just because they're not sure if things will come back, and they don't want to get locked in and then end up defaulting and having large lawsuits or bad credit, etc. So within the LOI, you want to make sure that you state your lease term, how many years you want, whether it's in years or in months. Those both are fine. Usually it's in years, but in the contract, in certain areas, it does state in months. So be aware of that. And also, when I put out a LOI in the lease term section, a lot of times I'll also put in the option term if I have an option that I want to request. So in my opinion, the more capital that a tenant plans to put into the space, so let's say you get like an office shelf space or a retail shelf space that you need to build out, and let's say you have to spend $100,000, you probably would want a longer term lease just so you can secure that, and that would be for accounting purposes. And I think usually if you're going to put in a decent amount of money, there's a good chance that the landlord has to put in a good amount of money in conjunction through tenant improvement. So if both are on the same page with the capital expenditures that are required to get a business running, typically both will be in agreement that the term should be longer. So personally, I think the more money you spend, the longer term you should sign. And usually when you're spending more money up front, it means that you are a secure business and you know what you're doing. So you have a lot more confidence in your business that it will succeed. So you're more willing to put out that capital expenditure up front. And you want it to, you kind of want it to be amortized over a long period of time anyway, so you have enough time to make your money back before the landlord decides to bump the rent significantly. Okay, and when it comes to tenant improvement allowance on the term, I would say if a landlord is willing to give tenant improvement allowance, usually they're going to give more if you sign a longer term lease. And I'll cover this later, but tenant improvement allowance, I find landlords that are larger, so more institutional landlords or REITs are going to be more than willing to give tenant improvement allowance. I think it has to do with the way they do their accounting, and also has to do with the fact that they have, most likely they have a ton of attorneys on staff, and they are more than happy and more than willing to go after the tenant for what they are owed if the tenant ends up defaulting. Okay, and different landlords and tenants will have different preferences in terms of reasons for a long-term or a shorter term. So I've seen more cautious office landlords go for shorter term because, and especially if they're like smaller and more mom and pop, the typical difference that I find between larger institutional landlords and mom and pop landlords is really the willingness to pay for attorneys. If they have a build, like this is their one and only retirement building that they're using in order to live out the rest of their life, they're not sophisticated enough to have attorneys or be willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars to chase after money. So a lot of times they, and even when they collect all the financial information for a tenant and review, they still may not be very confident in their decision. So they may only do 1 year, 2 years, 3-year leases just to have an idea if that tenant is an honorable, reasonable, honest tenant that will pay rent and has a good business. And if that's the case, they'll extend the lease. But they're always afraid to have to go through the eviction process. So that's kind of a interesting thing that I found between the larger and the smaller landlords. And there's different plays too. Sometimes landlords want a shorter term lease because they want to match the termination dates for the property for all the leases if they want to redevelop or tear down the building. So you don't want one tenant out of 10 having a 10-year lease and everybody else having a 1-year lease. Then you still have to wait 10 years. In order to redevelop. So, and also refinancing is a huge thing. They want their base rents to be high so that the bank sees that they have good cash flow and then they can refinance their building. So those are all different strategies, and sales strategies as well is another thing. If they want to sell soon, then they're gonna want longer term, especially if it's something that's not going to be redeveloped through the sale. And then also if it's owner user, there are different strategies with that too. So actually, think right now, industrial buildings are probably selling better if they are vacant because at least within our general demographic in our territory in the San Gabriel Valley, you have a lot of companies that want to own their own real estate and their business in one. So those owner users are probably more willing, they're willing to pay probably more than an investor would for a single tenant or single industrial space. Okay, any questions? Moment?
Sorry, no questions yet.
Okay. All right, so next item is lease and rent commencement. So you'll hear about a bunch of different dates. There can be a possession date, a lease commencement date, rent commencement date. And in the AIR lease, it's going to be pretty straightforward. It'll tell you when the rent commencement date is or lease commencement date is. And if you have a early possession date, all that stuff is just fill in the blank. But there are plenty of other leases that are customized by attorneys for larger institutional landlords where everything kind of shifts together. So you may sign the lease, but that lease may not actually commence yet until the landlord does their work and delivers the space to the tenant. So, and we don't necessarily know when that date would be. It could be, maybe the landlord needs to put up a wall, needs to put in restrooms, maybe needs to do, a list of items, and it could take them anywhere from a month to 3 months to complete that work. And you don't know if it's going to be 1 or 3 months, but once they're complete, then they deliver it. And then the tenant officially takes over and starts their lease term. So sometimes you'll have leases that just have almost no dates on them, but everything is linked together to either the signing date, and then you also have maybe an amendment later that's going to tell you that, okay, the rent commencement date is X. So keep that in mind. But if we're keeping it simple and we're doing smaller deals, the AIR lease is going to be very clear on what these dates are. And I try to keep it clear as much as I can. But we have large landlords that have that other type of extensive lease structure. So just keep that in mind. And it's usually just based on the size of the landlord, whether or not they have their own lease, or if they're willing to use the AIR or CAR leases. Okay, and the rent commencement date can change based on rent abatement and free rent, etc. I talked about landlord's work already, so just keep all that in mind. It's important because sometimes, and I mean, it's not going to be a huge deal for the most part, but there are instances where you think you're signing a 3-year lease with 3 free months. So let's just take that as an example. 3-year lease with 3 months free rent. So is that a 3-year full term, or is that 3 years and 3 months? So different landlords and different tenants will ask for different things. So potentially, like a larger landlord typically will say, okay, I'll give you 3 months free, but the 3 months don't count as part of the 3 years. So they'll give you the 3 months up front, then your 3 years starts, because they want a full 3-year lease term. Other landlords, mom and pops, in my opinion, or in my experiences, the 3 months is within that three years. So it ends up being 3 months free up front, and then they have 2 years and 9 months after that, and then the lease expires or terminates. Okay. All right, next is base rent. This is kind of the number that most tenants, especially small tenants, are going to focus on, and definitely what the smaller landlords will focus on. Surprisingly, this is not always the most important item for larger landlords and larger tenants, because in my opinion, the smaller tenants that are more focused on the base rent, they haven't got a huge grasp or a complete understanding of their whole business, and they focus a lot more on the negotiation of these dollar amounts, where ultimately a rent expense in a larger business is it's, I don't know, let's say 5%, 10% of everything. So it's not something that I think is as crucial if you really know your business. Obviously, it's a huge component. It's a large expense and overhead, but it's not the only. You need to consider operations of your business a lot more. And in the base rent, so what I normally do is I will include whether it's a triple net or if it's modified gross. It could be by per square foot, or it could be a gross number for the offer in the letter of intent. And so like right here, I said, you quote it either per square foot or by the year. And just keep in mind that in California, and I think in New York as well, we quote on a monthly basis for the rent. And in other parts of the country, I think they quote annually. So if you're online searching, you'll find both. So just realize, what it is. Make sure you know if it's a monthly number or annual number, because in certain instances, like in California, let's say you're searching for property on 3rd Street Promenade or Abbot Kinney, or some of the very high traffic areas. Like other people from other states who come by may actually see that, oh, it's only $36 or let's say $25 a square foot, and they'll think it's like a annual number. But in those super high traffic areas, it's $25 a square foot a month. So just keep that in mind. It'd be very silly if you got those mixed up. It'd be a little bit embarrassing. So yeah.
David, I do have a question that came across. Can you explain what is the NNN modified gross, industrial gross, and full service? What's the difference?
Sure. So industrial gross and modified gross are very, very similar. In industrial buildings, they just like to use the word modify or industrial gross. So I'll go from left to right. So full service gross just means, and it's usually, full service gross is usually used in office buildings. And it just means you pay $1 amount. Let's say it's $2,000 a month and it covers everything. So your $2,000 will cover your common area, your insurance, your all that kind of stuff. So you only have that one number. So it's just $2,000. The landlord, okay? And then a modified gross would be, let's say it's $2,000 modified gross. It would be $2,000 you pay, and on top of that, you have to pay for your utilities. Potentially. So let's say you have to also pay for water and electricity. Whereas a full service, they pay for it, they're in a large office building. So they pay for all the electricity, they pay for all the water for the restrooms, and you pay nothing else except for your flat rent. And then, so modified gross and industrial gross are very similar. Modified gross, you're gonna see that more in office buildings as well, maybe more smaller office buildings. And then the industrial gross would be in like an industrial park where there is some shared expenses, like maybe trash, or actually, I'm sorry, you pay for your own, it's separately metered, so you pay for your own electricity and maybe you pay for your own water, so just like the modified gross. And then the triple net is typically used in retail spaces, and the triple net, so there's 3 ends, and the first net is the insurance, the second net is the property tax, and then the third net is the common area maintenance. So in the same example, if I'm paying $2,000 triple net, that's $2,000 plus whatever triple net number that is quoted. So that triple net number that is quoted is a combination of the landlord side of the property tax, the landlord side of the insurance for the property, and then also all the common area maintenance costs that are associated with the property, such as trash and electricity on the outside, like let's say for the lights, and also for, let's say, the sprinkler system for gardening, and a slew of other potential things that are included in the triple net. And they will quote you a number. So you have $2,000 plus, let's say, $500 for the triple net. So then ultimately, if they're quoting $2,000 online and they're just saying, okay, $2,000 triple net, it's more of a $2,500 rent than it is a $2,000 rent. So you have to ask them what the triple net is. And typically, older buildings generally have, well, I can't say older buildings, buildings that have been owned by one landlord for a long time typically have a lower triple net. And properties that have been owned by landlord not so long usually have a higher triple net, and the whole reason behind that has to do with the property tax assessment and the property tax basis that they purchased the property at. It's because in California we have Prop 13 that limits the increase in property tax. So that's one thing to really watch out for too, is whether or not the ownership has owned it for a while, and if they plan on selling the property. Because if they've owned it for a long time and the triple nets are super low, and then they decide to sell the property, if you're not careful in your lease, then you would have to deal with that huge bump in property management or property tax that will be passed on from that new landlord to the tenant. Hope that answers the question. Any other questions?
No other questions at this time.
Great. Okay, and rent increase. pretty standard around here is 3% annually. It could be, and you can do a ton of different things. You can have an increase annually. You can have increase every 5 years, every 10 years. I would say in triple net lease deals, like let's say, like a McDonald's drive-through or a Starbucks drive-through, they tend to have fixed rent for at least 5 years, and then they have a bump of maybe 10%, or they have fixed rent for even 10 years, and then a bump of maybe 20% or something after that. And you also have CPI, which is like an index number that you can look up, and sometimes landlords like to use that. I personally avoid that just because there's different CPIs you can use, and I think it just gets a little bit more complicated than necessary. So I try to avoid that whenever I can, but occasionally you'll see it.
One more question.
Sure.
How do you make sure the landlord isn't lying about the amount for property tax?
You can ask them. So I guess there's two parts of this. I guess if you're asking before you sign a lease and then after you've already signed a lease, before you sign the lease, it's really like almost an honor system, but if you have a leverage, you can ask them for that documentation. But also in the lease, typically it says that they have to be willing to provide you those numbers if requested at least once a year. And honestly, like if you really wanted to, you can go to any title company and you can ask them what their basis is. And you find that number, and typically in Southern California, the tax number is approximately 1.25%. So, if it's like 2%, then you probably have an issue. They're probably lying. If it's 1.5%, there might be other assessments that have been tacked on. I know, like the city of El Monte has very high property tax for some reason. So there are exceptions to that rule, but you can look up how much the tax is online for each city, and on top of that, you can research with title what the basis for that property is. So with those two numbers, you should be able to back into it. And then also, if you know the size of that space that you're leasing as the whole relative to the center, then you'll know the actual dollar amount. But then you also have the full dollar amount for the entire center, and then divide that by the square footage, then you have the per square foot number that you'll be assessed with. Any other questions?
No other questions at this time.
Okay. Yeah, so usually the rent increase is going to be done annually, and it could, so previously I mentioned that certain leases have a commencement date, and then they have a lease commencement date or rent commencement date. So depending on how you write the lease, the increases could be based on the anniversary of either of those dates. Like it could be the date that you signed the lease, it could be the date you take occupancy, it could be the date that the landlord delivers the space to you. So just keep in mind, it could be any of those. And obviously, if you're representing a tenant, you want that date to be the later date. If you're the landlord, you want that to be the earlier date. And then also keep in mind that in typical leases and typical commissions, the rent increases count as part of your initial term rent, and that also in turn is part of your commission. So you're getting paid commission on that increase as well, not really with a flat number or just the first year number. Okay, next item is the security deposit. So this is pretty straightforward. You'll see this in residential deals or rentals and whatnot. But what you want to keep in mind is that this can be used in many different ways. In certain instances, when you have a tenant that is, and there's no limit to how much you can ask for a security deposit. I think in residential, I think you can only maximum ask for, I think, 3 months or something, regardless of how poor the credit of the tenant is. But in commercial, you can ask for as much as you want. So I've had security deposits that were a year's worth of rent. And obviously, I've also had tenants that have prepaid a full year because their credit was poor, or prepaid 6 months, etc. So, but when it comes to security deposit, the one thing to keep in mind that you can use as a lever is that if their credit is poor, or if they don't have credit, or they don't have experience, you just increase the security deposit. And if they have bad credit, you can increase the security deposit just to give the landlord a little bit more security. And tenants obviously don't want to do that because then their money is just sitting there, not doing anything, not making money. But it kind of needs to be done in the beginning, especially when there's so much uncertainty with that tenant. So one thing I like to also do when we do collect a large security deposit is to credit them back, in certain months of their lease term. So let's say they sign a 5-year lease. Let's say we took a 6-month security deposit. So maybe after year 1, so month 13, I'll credit them 1 month's rent from their security deposit. And then maybe in year 3, month 25, I'll credit them back again. And then maybe by the end of their lease term, they only have, let's say, 2 months of security deposit left with the landlord when they started off with 6. So there's ways to structure that that I think is pretty fair, because it gives them an opportunity to lease up space, gives the tenant an opportunity to lease space that they otherwise probably don't deserve, or are not credit worthy enough to obtain. But it also doesn't have to tie their hands in terms of their cash forever, or at least until the lease term ends. So there's a little bit more flexibility there. And then also gives the landlord enough security that, hey, these tenants are going to be good and they're going to stick around. And if they don't, I have the security. But then once they are consistent in paying their rent and doing everything that they're supposed to do, that, the landlord will feel confident in giving and crediting back some money. So, and also, you can also ask for a letter of credit in lieu of a large deposit. If you guys are unfamiliar with letter of credit, I guess we can explain that later if someone has a question, but that's something that a bank will be willing to do. There's some charges involved, but it would be the bank essentially holding the money as a deposit.
David, I do have a couple questions that came in.
Sure.
The first one, can you say what CPI stands for?
I can't remember. I think it's something index. Not commercial. I'm sure someone else on here knows exactly what it is. I'm blanking on it right now. Consumer price index. That's what it was.
Awesome. The next question, do the months that tenants get free rent count towards commission as if tenant is paying full rent?
No, typically no. And I always say typically because in commercial, you can negotiate whatever you want. But typically, if you do not get paid commissions on free rent months.
Okay, and the last one, what's the difference between key money and security deposit?
So key money, you never get back. That typically happens now with restaurants. The key money, it's just you paying to take the space. And that money, I guess, accounting wise, it goes towards the equipment of the space. But key money, so there's two kind of things that are equivalent when it comes to, like, there's key money and there's buying a business, right? Key money, it typically is the landlord that has a space that that is usually a restaurant ready or some sort of food use, and they want to get some money for the fact that they have that infrastructure. So they'll charge key money and take that money up front, and they're never giving that key money back. That's a payment, essentially, for the equipment. Um, so it's very similar to like an asset sale. So when you have an asset sale, you buy those assets from the tenant, but with key money, you're buying it from the landlord. And with the security deposit, you know, you're supposed to get at least a majority of that back at the end of your lease term, but key money is not something you're never going to get back. But you may be able to sell that stuff later, so it could be another transaction, so kind of get it back.
One more. Does the landlord usually pay commission on the full term of the lease? Do they pay up front in one lump sum or in different installments? What if a tenant does not perform in a later date?
So that's pretty negotiable, but generally speaking, and I will talk about commissions later, just a little bit, but with retail, it's typically split 50-50, so 50% upfront and then 50% when the business opens. With office and industrial, it's typically upfront or when they open, but they usually open immediately or, you know, within like a few weeks or a few months. But retail is the weird one where, you know, because you have that extensive build out and you have to get permits and all that kind of jazz. So it does get split a lot. And then you normally, I mean, I personally don't give back my my commission, but if I'm feeling generous and I've worked with the landlord before and, you know, we have a good relationship, if the tenant ends up defaulting, let's say the tenant signs for a 5-year term, right? And I already got paid out my full 5 years commission, and we're in year 2, and then the tenant just disappears, and the landlord doesn't want to go after them for the remaining term. They just want to lease up the rest of the space. What I will do is offer kind of like a credit. So I will help them lease up the space again for free, at least for, you know, whatever uncollected or unamortized commission cost. So I will, you know, credit them that portion. And if we end up signing, like, let's say another 5-year, then I'll probably charge them for, you know, 2 of those 5, but I won't charge them for the 3 that essentially they've already paid me. But that doesn't necessarily work if you have a broker on the other side of the deal. So I always try to mention that ahead of time too, that if there is a broker on the other side of the deal, you're still gonna have to shell out to them or not take their business. Yeah, and was there another part of that question that I missed?
I think that covered everything.
Okay. All right. Next item, rent abatement. Rent abatement is just free rent. And what I find is that the smaller landlords are more than happy to give rent abatement versus tenant improvement. And once again, I think that's a cash flow and accounting thing. So, you know, I think most people would agree that they rather not give any money and give time than give out money up front and maybe never get it back. So that's kind of what these small mom and pop landlords are looking at. So they'll be more than happy to trade free months up front or during the lease term instead of paying tenant improvement allowance, which is, you know, you have to give them up front. And with tenant improvement allowance, you know, if the tenant ends up defaulting, you are technically allowed to get that money back, but you have to go through, you know, attorneys. So once again, you know, that's the difference that you're gonna see with larger landlords and smaller landlords. And when we ask for rent abatement, you know, it's all a calculation. You're gonna have to take into account the rent abatement, the base rent, the tenant improvement, rent increases, all that stuff comes in pretty much as one number. But upfront, like if you're asking for rent abatement, I would say a decent rule of thumb is you probably end up with maybe 1 month out of 12 months that you can get abated. So if you end up signing a longer term lease, you probably will get more abatement than if you sign a shorter term lease. So rule of thumb there. And then, like I mentioned before, you can, if you default, unamortized rent abatement can be included in the damages. And also, keep in mind that rent abatement doesn't have to be all up front. I think people have the misconception that if you're giving rent abatement or taking rent abatement, that it has to be all up front. And a lot of times, it's given so you can get your permits, or you can, move in without having to pay double rent, things like that. But, it can just be used as equivalent of cash and part of the negotiations. And it can be spread through the term of the lease. I've had many deals where, because once again, the landlord was not super confident with the tenant, so they didn't want to give them all the free rent up front, because obviously you can't ever get that back. So, or you can, but you have to go through, legal means to get it back. So they rather give maybe 3 months up front, and then if they owe another 3 months, they'll give it in year 2 or year 3 or year 4, when they know the tenant is steady and secure by then.
I have a question that came in, and I was trying to clarify. I think they're saying, what do you think about a personal guarantee? Do you suggest that?
Yes. So I'm going to talk about personal guarantees later, but most landlords will require it. And also, if you sign a lease as an individual, you're already personally guaranteeing the lease legally. You don't necessarily have to be in the personal guarantee section, or you don't have to actually sign a guarantee of lease for you to be the guarantor of that lease. So, I think, trying to sidestep that is going to be very hard. Very rarely. So the only time I've seen landlords not ask for a personal guarantee is if they're prepaying a ton of money up front, or they have a huge security deposit in cash, because then that in itself is a guarantee. Any other questions?
Another one just came. Oh, sorry.
Oh, and obviously, if you're representing a tenant and you can get away with not having a personal guarantee, then by all means you should, because a guarantee is a very hefty weight to be on someone, especially if the lease is large.
Another question that came in is, who is responsible for the NNN expense during the rent abatement?
So that's also negotiable. Obviously, the landlords want the tenants to be paying the triple net during the abatement time period, but obviously the tenants don't want to pay it during the abatement time period. So I've had both, and that always comes up. So if I'm representing a tenant, I always say, during rent abatement, it is base rent and triple nets abated. And if I'm representing a landlord, I will say only base rent abated. And, I would say, gosh, 75% of the time, the other side's going to say no. And then you end up just coming to some sort of compromise potentially, or moving, or giving them something else in lieu of that. Any other questions?
No, that's all I have at this time.
Okay. So next is tenant improvement allowance. This kind of works hand in hand with base rent as well as rent abatement. Larger landlords will give this, like I said. Smaller landlords typically will not. If they do, they give a very small amount, or they maybe do some work for you at a, with a cheaper contractor. So typically you'll ask for the tenant improvement based on a per square foot number. Let's say you're renting 2,000 square feet, you would ask for, let's say, $20 a square foot. So you multiply $20 by 2,000, and that's the actual number that you get. And You can also just ask for a flat number, like let's say I just want $10,000. You put that in the LOI, that's fine too. And yeah, typically larger landlords will give it, smaller landlords will not, and that's all just typical. But there's exceptions to that rule. And with the tenant improvement, there are also instances where the landlord will only pay out. So there's usually the landlord pays out tenant improvement once all the work is complete. So the tenant still has to spend that money up front. What landlords definitely don't want is to give out that money up front and the tenant runs away with all that money, because it sometimes is a hefty sum. I've had I think if you guys are familiar with Ding Tai Fung, the dumpling restaurant in Arcadia in the mall, and then also at the Grove. The Grove gave, I believe they gave Ding Tai Fung at least the initial offer, and they probably end up giving them more. They gave them $1 million in tenant improvement allowance for them to come to the Grove. So it's a hefty sum. So you don't want to give that until they actually complete their work. So the tenant needs to be mindful that they need to have that kind of capital ready in order to build out. And this is more so for, I think, small businesses, like especially if you're trying to open up a restaurant or some sort of dessert shop. You have to keep in mind that there's a time frame and then a dollar amount that you need to spend up front to get that business up and running. Like if it's just a small office space, tenant improvements negligible. It's really paint and carpet, so not that big a deal. So keeping in mind that you're only going to get that back after you're complete and probably open for business. So you need to be able to have that cash on hand at your disposal. But I have seen instances where maybe the tenant has a little bit more leverage. They will be able to get installment payments of tenant improvement during the construction. So if it's a large tenant, and they're asking for a decent amount of tenant improvement and they're a really good credit tenant, then the landlord may be willing to give installments, 3 installments or 2 installment payments of the tenant improvement allowance, just to make sure that the tenant doesn't run out of cash and that they keep moving forward. So I've seen where the tenant has to demonstrate that they're complete with 50% of the work from the contractor and also from the city, certain things that are signed off. Then the landlord will give them 50% of that tenant improvement allowance, and then once they complete the work entirely, then the landlord gives the second 50% of that allowance, and then everything moves on from there. So those are 2 different options that you may encounter when it comes to tenant improvement allowance. And just like rent abatement, it can be amortized over the term of the lease, both in accounting and also in the court of law. If they default, the landlord can come after the tenant for that tenant improvement allowance that is unamortized. So unamortized just means, let's say you sign a 5-year deal, and you take the tenant improvement that's supposed to be, let's say you take $1 million in tenant improvement over 5 years, and you leave after year 2, you technically still owe the landlord $600,000. So they can come after you for that because that's unamortized.
Another question that came in, actually a couple, I'm sorry. Rule of thumb, how much TI will be offered, like a percentage of the rent collected over the term of the lease?
There is no real rule of thumb when it comes to tenant improvement allowance. I mean, I've seen as low as $10. I've seen as high as $120 a square foot. And like the only thing I can say that there's more consistency with is that larger institutional landlords will give tenant improvement, and if the space is in only in shell condition, there's more likelihood to get tenant improvement allowance. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the smaller landlords are, the less likely they're going to give tenant improvement allowance, and also the more built out a space is, the less tenant improvement allowance you're going to get. But the spectrum is pretty broad. But maybe, like, I would say gosh, if I were to have to give a number, it would be somewhere between $20 and $40 if they're giving.
Awesome. Next question. If asbestos is discovered during TI, tenant or landlord, who is responsible for paying for the removal?
That I'm not too sure about. I think, well, the only thing I can say is you should probably inspect ahead of time. Good landlords will probably take care of it. But in other instances, like if it were a retail space in the lease, you're probably gonna, I mean, the landlord would take care of it, but essentially they would charge you back for it. So effectively, you would be paying anyway.
Does the same go for fire separation? If that is required by the city, who would be responsible for paying for that?
That's all negotiable. So those are things that need to be ironed out ahead of time. So you need to have, like if you're building out space, and usually if you're not doing things to the space, there won't be new requirements from the city because everything will be grandfathered in. It's when you start knocking down walls and you start moving things structurally, or you end up changing the use of the space. That's when the cities and permitting and health departments, then that's when they start getting involved, and those type of costs could arise. And then it becomes potentially an issue. But typically landlords will know the rules. So let's say a good example would be fire sprinklers. If you have an older building and you're not doing anything extensive, you can keep going without fire sprinklers. But if you hit a certain threshold in your spending and the work that you're doing, or if you change the use of, like, let's say an entire floor, you may have to put in a fire suppression system, and that's gonna be tens of thousands of dollars. And then who takes on that cost? That has to be negotiated ahead of time. So one thing is, like, if you're planning on spending a lot of money and doing a lot of work, what you need to do is get an architect involved that understands the code and requirements and the cost of those things. And if they don't know the cost, then they need to, or you need to find a contractor, or they need to refer a contractor to you that is familiar with that type of requirement. So that's also why in the very beginning I was mentioning, you want to have a good team of affiliates that you can count on. I have a few architects that I typically will call and ask questions if I have anything related to that. I have people in the city, planners or former planners, that I can ask certain questions, or you just ask the planning department for that space direct.
David, I have no more questions at this time. I don't know if you can hear me, but your sound seems to have paused.
Don't want to pay for it. So a lot of times if you're going to do a lot of work, they're going to say, hey, it's all on you. You take it as is. And if there's anything else that needs to be upgraded, it's on you. That's going to be the smaller landlords. And actually the larger landlords too. The larger landlords follow their contract to the T. So if they have to give it to you, they'll give it to you. If they agree to give it to you, they'll give it to you. If they didn't agree to give it to you, you won't get it. So that's also important to understand these type of requirements ahead of time, especially if you're trying to do a larger, more substantial lease.
No more questions at this time.
Okay, awesome. So moving on. Okay, so tenant options. This is pretty important. So, if a business is doing well, they want to have an option. And an option is just, basically additional lease term that the tenant can take or not take. So they're called tenant options because it's a tenant's choice. Okay, and there are different types of options. There's where I have right here FMV, that's fair market value. You have a fixed percentage increase. You have CPI, which we talked about. before, or just a predetermined flat rate. I would say most landlords aren't going to give a super favor. I've rarely seen options that are less than a 3% increase or less than what the initial term increases are. The reason being, and the reason why we call it a tenant option, is because these options only benefit the tenant. I've heard tenants tell me, oh, well, the landlord, will get additional term. Don't they want that? Well, yes, they want that, but they want that at the rate that they want. They want it at the rent that they want. So, this is just like the same thing as buying an option when it comes to stocks. You have a choice to take it or not take it. So let's say, and you run two scenarios, right? If at that point, the option term comes, if the tenant has a below or above market rent at that time. If the tenant has a below market rent, then obviously they're going to take the option, assuming they still want to be in business and assuming they still want to be in that space. They will take that option. If they are paying above market rent, then obviously they're not going to take that option, and they're going to renegotiate with the landlord and say, hey, the option is for $4 a square foot. Rents right now in the area are $3.50 a square foot. I'm not going to take the option. I want $3.50, right? So the landlord is stuck with the option if it's vice versa. So the tenant option is, for the tenant. And in my opinion, I would always try to get a tenant option for the tenant. And there are landlords that won't give options unless, they're a very, very good tenant, because they don't want to be locked in with a bad tenant. Okay, and also keep in mind that in your typical lease, that a tenant option will have a specific window of time that needs to be executed. So you have to take that option, or at least tell the landlord you want that option within that window. Once that window passes, and landlords are very smart. They know exactly when that time frame is, and if they know that you're paying below market rent, they're not going to remind you that there's a tenant option and your window is coming up, let's say like in a month. They're just going to be quiet, let it pass, and then they'll say, well, sorry, your option passed, so now we just have to go to fair market rent or whatever it is that you negotiate at that time. So just be cognizant that there's a time frame, and you need to exercise that option during that time frame. And most tenant options do not transfer when let's say you sell the business. And a lot of times too, the option won't transfer if, like, let's say the percentage of shares in your business shifts significantly. So, and there could be different thresholds for that number as well. So let's say, before it was just you owning the whole business, and all of a sudden it's you and your best friend that own the business 50-50. Then if there's a 50%, and the difference in that change, maybe stay in the lease, and generally it is, but if it's over a certain number, then that option does not transfer. So keep that in mind.
No other questions at this time.
Okay, great. All right, and use. So this is probably more important for retail. You just want to make sure that you guys have complementary uses within a center. And there's obviously different uses that landlords don't want. So they will limit you on your type of use based on your business plan. Couple uses that are very unpopular are, like, let's say strip clubs and massage parlors, and maybe like nightclubs, things that are a little bit in the gray area are going to be less popular. And it's important for landlords to predetermine what that use is, so they can manage it, and they don't want to if they don't want to have overlap in the building or in the shopping center, then you can give exclusives as well. But you want to list out what the actual use is for that tenant so they can stay within that box. Because there are also, tenants who maybe don't know what they're doing yet in terms of their business. I've had examples where, people go in and they say, okay, I want to open up an ice cream shop. And then all of a sudden they change from an ice cream shop, then they want to, do a tea shop, and then, or they want to do a bakery. But then you already have those uses in the center, and the landlord maybe didn't prevent them from switching their uses. Then, it causes friction and it causes problems within the center. So you want to just make sure that this is something that is already laid out in the lease and also in the LOI.
Another question, do you think that lease with option would help to sell the property or obtain financing compared to a lease with no option?
Wait, I'm sorry, say it again. You cut out a little bit.
Think the lease with option helps landlord to sell the property or obtain financing compared to lease with no option?
It kind of depends. So where the options come into play more in a purchase and sale that I found is that when a buyer is potentially purchasing the property in order to redevelop or re-tenant, they prefer to not have those options because they consider when you have an option, more often than not, the landlord or the buyer will consider that option term as something that the tenant is most likely going to take. So, and especially if it's a favorable option, if they know that rent on that option is low, then it's almost a guarantee that that tenant's going to exercise that option. So that's going to hurt your sales if you have an option at a really low rent. So like I said, the options generally don't help the landlord or the seller.
Awesome. Then we had a question. Obviously, this will be posted to the AAR website later today. Are you also able to provide a copy of the slides for people to have access to, or do you prefer just the recording?
Yeah, they can have the slides.
Okay, so we will post those later as well.
Okay.
And then that's the last of the questions that I have in at the moment.
Okay, so landlord's work. This is actually very important, especially when it comes to retail and let's say space that is not yet improved or just completely first generation and not totally built out. So it's very important that the tenant knows how the space is delivered, and if they need more things, that they ask the landlord for it. So I've come across situations where tenants that weren't as savvy and they didn't read their contracts, and the thing is, it's very important for them to get a contractor too that understands these buildings and then the mechanical issues and whatever electrical issues, all that stuff, and the costs involved. If they don't understand it, they can end up losing out on a lot of money. So I've had instances where tenants coming in, and it's specifically written that how the landlord is going to deliver the space. And I've had instances where, and I was representing a landlord, so obviously I'm not going to bring it up because it's not my duty or my job to. The tenant didn't realize that the space doesn't come with an HVAC unit, let's say, and then or the gas lines aren't there, or the electrical is only to the box. So they don't realize how far they have to go from the source to get all of that to the building or to their space. And that could be tens of thousands of, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and also if you have to deal with ADA compliance, like let's say ADA restroom, when you take a regular restroom, or let's say you have to build out an ADA restroom, you're talking about anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000, just to do that. So all those things you need to really know how the landlord is going to give you the space, and also how you want that space, because these are big ticket items that are being negotiated here, and if you're unaware of them, you're gonna get taken advantage of. And then your original cost that you thought was going to be maybe $50,000 of improvements, it's going to end up being $100,000 in improvements, just by not being aware.
Quick question. How do tenants protect themselves from failure to obtain occupancy permits from the city?
So I can cover that a little later too.
Okay.
It would be a contingency. So, if you know you're going to be changing the use of the space, and if you require a CUP, which is a conditional use permit from the city, if I were representing a tenant, I would put in a contingency in there that they need to obtain those permits, or else they can essentially, get out of the lease. So, and landlords don't like to do that. So that's always going to be something that is negotiated. And what I found to be the middle ground when it comes to that is that you give the tenant X months, let's say, and the landlord has to be okay with that change of use, right? And I would say several years ago, it was very popular for people or for tenants to take space that is regular retail and turn into either like a dessert shop or a restaurant, and that requires a change of use. So, and that's one of those more extensive types of change of use. But I would, if I were representing a landlord, well, the middle ground in that situation is giving, let's say, 2 or 3 months to the tenant to work out with the city if they can get that change of use. And in those few months, like the tenant would have to create drawings and submit it to the city and get some sort of approval. And what I would normally do is, the only reason or the only way the tenant can get out of the lease is if they can't get the CUP, but it has to be because either the landlord didn't perform or the city wouldn't allow it. If the tenant is just slow in getting their paperwork in, or if the tenant all of a sudden after 3 months decides, oh, this is not the business that I want to run, that normally we wouldn't allow that in the lease as a way out. So at that point, either they lose their deposit or they might lose even more if it goes to court. So that's typically how it work it, because the landlord doesn't want to give a bunch of free rent and then also have a lease out there and then end up spending that time when they could have had another tenant that could have actually gotten the business started, right? So there's a little give and take in that negotiation as well. So that's typically how we've seen it resolved. But I also always recommend that the tenant goes to the city directly and finds out for themselves how long that process typically will take, and talk to the city directly to obtain all the information that they need, because there's different things. There's also there's a CUP, there's also AUPs, and there's other types of things in different cities that may prevent you from getting something done. And like an AUP is going to be significantly faster. That's an administrative use permit where it's just done in-house. A CUP requires a hearing. So you have people from just residents from the city attending those hearings that might complain, and then maybe it doesn't pass. So there's risk there. So how to mitigate that risk is with the contingency.
Okay, no other questions.
Okay, and then last thing with landlord's work, I would just make sure that if there's any work getting done, that it's done by a licensed contractor. Okay, and tenants work, same thing, just reversed. You want to make sure that the tenant knows what they need to do in order to get their business up and running. and read these sections thoroughly. You know, the landlords that are very experienced, they'll say you need to do, you know, a whole list of things as a tenant, and just make sure you know what those things are and how much those cost, and you know how long it's going to take. Okay, how are we doing on time? Are we okay? Do we need to?
It's advertised up until 12:30 p.m. So we're good.
Okay, so I'm going to go into these additional items on the right. I'll go through them pretty quick. So if you guys have any specific questions, and we covered some of these already. So if you have any specific questions, definitely ask, or else I'm just going to try to blow through these.
Sounds good.
Oops, sorry, wrong button. Okay, so insurance, this is an easy one. Just ask your insurance agent. Give them the section that has to do with insurance. The typical AR lease has $1 million per incident, $2 million aggregate. And as an agent for a landlord, I will not give over keys until we have a check, and also general liability insurance for that tenant. Because once they step in the building, and if anything happens and they don't have insurance, then it's on the landlord's insurance. And I don't want the landlord yelling at me that their insurance premium went up because I did not get insurance from the tenant. All right. And I would always add additional insured on the insurance. It's like an extra layer of protection for the landlord at no additional cost to anybody. Okay. Parking, actually, this is relatively important when it comes to shopping centers and office buildings, well, even industrial buildings. Just make sure that everybody is aware of how many parking spaces they are allowed, how many they are not allowed, if they have reserved parking, unreserved parking. You know, in certain areas, like let's say downtown LA, Pasadena even, in these office buildings, the parking spaces are very expensive. So maybe the space, you know, your lease comes with 1 parking space or 0 parking spaces. Make sure you know how much it costs to either rent or lease out a parking spot. Because if it's $50 or $100 a month, and you have X amount of employees, that's you know, that could be a big chunk of your rent. Could go to parking. So definitely keep that in mind. And also, if you know that you're going to have a pretty high traffic type of use, you want to make sure that there's sufficient parking, or else, you know, I've seen centers where, you know, they have decent amount of parking, but then you end up with a tenant who occupies a ton of parking. And that kind of does hurt other tenants in the center as well. So you want to make sure that two wouldn't clash, and then you would have enough parking for everybody, even though they require a lot of parking when they are in operation. So there's little, you know, puzzle pieces that you can kind of shift to make parking work out for everybody. But also, you also want to make sure, and this is something that you'll have to check with the city, if they even have enough parking. I have centers that are overparked, or I mean, they're underparked because there's not enough spaces for the actual uses that are in the center. So if you're trying to change the use from something that is a lower parking ratio, let's say a clothing store, into a restaurant, you're going to require more parking spaces in the center. And a lot of times, if you don't have that excess amount of parking spaces, the city will not allow you to change that use. Okay, so understand your parking ratios. That's all going to be in documents at the city under general plan or specific plan. So that's something, you know, definitely keep aware of. Guarantee of lease, we covered this a little bit, but just keep in mind that if you sign a lease as an individual, you are guaranteeing that lease. Okay. And one other thing that's more unique that you're not going to see very often, right here, the rolling guarantee. So if you have a tenant that doesn't want to guarantee the entire lease, you can do a rolling guarantee, which just means that, and depending on how long it's rolling for, it would be like, let's say you decide to end the lease, terminate the lease, you are only on the hook for another, let's say 12 months or 24 months. So that's what the rolling guarantee means. That the example would be, okay, so I signed a 5-year lease. I have a rolling guarantee for 24 months. If I leave after year 1, I'm only responsible for year 2 and year 3. I would not be responsible for year 4 and year 5. But let's say I leave in year 2, or after year 2, I would be responsible for year 3 and 4, but not for year 5. So it caps out the tenant's amount that they have to guarantee. And also, keep in mind that if the landlord ends up leasing out the space for the rest of your term, whatever term that they're actually getting rent on, you don't have to pay those damages unless you already negotiated and prepaid it out. That's a different story. But if you haven't paid it out, and then the landlord ends up leasing up the space, you only have to essentially cover the difference as a guarantor. Any questions?
Nothing.
Okay. And assignment and sublease. This is important for, I would say, well, for office and actually for everybody. Right now, there's a ton of subleasing going on in the office space, in the office sector, because everyone is reducing their footprint because everyone's working from home. So subletting, like I think in America, we've hit a record high in office subleasing out there. So make sure you read this language and make sure it's not too cumbersome for the tenant to do a sublease or assignment. An assignment and a sublease are very similar, but technically the difference is who's still left on the hook, and I think who is paying the rent to who. So in a sublease, the sublessee still pays the rent to the sublessor, and then the sublessor pays the rent to the landlord. In an assignment, I think it's just more direct. So the person who the lease is assigned to will pay the landlord directly. But in an assignment, the tenant is also, the original tenant is still on the hook in most cases. But definitely read that language and make sure it's not too cumbersome, because what you don't want is for you as a tenant needing to sublease or assign the space, and you actually have someone willing to take it, but the landlord doesn't approve, or the landlord takes so long to approve that that person or that office or that potential new sublessee or tenant ends up going somewhere else. So there is language in there in most leases that deal with time frame and like reasonable time frames and turnaround times, all of that. So definitely keep that in mind. And especially if you are starting a business that you actually expect to sell, you want to make sure that you can get out of that lease or when you sell the business and just be completely out with zero liability because you sold it. They sign a new lease with the new tenant or the buyer of your business, so you can be clean and you can move on, as opposed to still having that potential liability on the lease contract. Okay. Contingencies. So we mentioned this before. Yeah, you just want to make sure that if you might have any issues, that you put a contingency in there. It could be really anything you want. Anything that you feel might be a potential issue, put a contingency in there. Obviously, the landlord doesn't have to accept it. So, I mentioned the ones that are more standard. So stick with those. Obviously, if there's other issues that are non-standard, you can bring those up. But also keep in mind that, these things can kill deals. So if you're asking for too much, the landlord just say, we're going to pass. We're going to move on to someone else. Yeah, and then last point here is contingency timeframes can be extended because sometimes you just need a little bit more time. Everybody's trying really hard to get their approval, and it's just the city is slow, or COVID happens, right? So you never know what may happen. As long as both sides agree, you can extend, or if it's already written that there are extensions. All right, commissions, we mentioned somewhat already, but I would just make sure if you don't have an agreement, just make sure you put your commission request in your LOI. And especially if you don't know the listing agent on the other side, ask first. Recently, I did ask, they said 2.5%. And then when I asked again, they said 2%. I was like, are you kidding me? Put in, and you can also request more than they're offering, but you just need to make sure that your tenant is on board with you, on you getting your commission. But sometimes, if it's too late and like the tenant already wants a space, there's almost nothing you can do at that point. So definitely ask ahead of time and then try to confirm it as much as you can. Okay, and large, so this is a cool thing. Large office lease transactions, like in those office towers, like let's say in Pasadena and Glendale and downtown LA, a lot of times they pay 4% to the tenant side. I'm sorry, I wrote buyer here, but to the tenant side. So that's very cool. Okay, exclusive use, mostly in retail. I would encourage, if you're representing the tenant, to get an exclusive as much as you can, or else you might have multiple of the same use. Like you have like 3 hair salons in one center, or 2 nail salons. That's always going to hurt your business. So make sure you get an exclusive for your tenant. And there's certain exclusives that like you can't really have an exclusive on selling soda, because there might be multiple restaurants in there, but you can't have exclusive on I'm the only Chinese restaurant, or I'm the only Italian restaurant, in the center. So keep all that in mind. Try to get your tenant the exclusive. If you're the landlord, try not to give it, but I would still say, this is not that big a deal for landlords, because good landlords want tenants not to overlap. Signage, this is important for retail, sometimes for office. Just realize that signs need to be approved by the city, and there is a time frame to doing that, and also cities have certain requirements. Sometimes landlords have certain requirements on the look because they have a signage program within their center that you have to follow. So ask them in advance if you have that, and generally signage is paid for by the tenant. Sometimes you can negotiate where the landlord will pay for it, but I would say for the most part, you're going to see that the tenant has to pay for the sign above their space and also on the monument signs and the big signs. Okay, relocation clause only happens really in retail. If there's something in large landlords like malls and huge shopping centers will have these clauses. If you're representing a tenant, I would say try to cross the whole thing out, because this will interrupt your business. They say like kind, and it's not necessarily like. They probably put you from a great location and then put you in the back corner, because it's all subjective as to what is considered like kind. They might give you a space that is like a triangle, even though it's the same square footage. All sorts of things can happen, especially if they have a lot of leverage and they're a big landlord. And if they wrote this in a way that is favorable to them, and the tenant didn't pay attention. So in my opinion, representing tenths, cross the whole thing out. Radius restriction, similar, but I think fair enough. Just you need to understand that business and what's a fair radius. If it's a denser area, a shorter radius is fine. If it's a not so dense area, you probably want a longer radius is probably what the tenant would, or what the landlord would want. So this just means that the landlord will not allow you to open another location within that radius, because they don't want your business to be competing with, or your other location to be competing with this location that you're signing. Okay, so these are all the items. That's pretty much it. If there's any final questions, feel free to ask right now. This is my contact information. You know, I'm happy to answer anything. Feel free to call me, email me. We will send out these slides. I'll send this to Stephanie and she can distribute. And also I want to just say, if you guys are interested in commercial real estate, join the Arcadia Association Commercial Committee. You know, we meet monthly right now online, but you know, we also do a lot of events like this, and you know, we would love to have more participation from our membership. And we are the largest committee in the Arcadia Association of Realtors. Yeah, any final questions? I know we're right at time.
I don't see anything coming in yet.
Okay, we'll give it, I guess, a minute if anyone has anything they want to ask. Anything you want to share for next week or next month? Sorry, Stephanie. Okay. Sorry, any questions? Last questions? Or we're gonna...
No, I'm not seeing anything. Everyone's thanking you and saying they love the presentation. And I want to tell you, thank you also, David. It was really informative and you gave us so much information and I really appreciate that.
All right, appreciate being here. Always like to speak to everybody, share some knowledge, and hopefully help you guys close some deals. So yeah, I appreciate the time, and you know, keep joining us for our webinars every month. Thanks, everyone.